Welcome to the Writing 1 presentation, Organizing Your Paper. Please follow along with this presentation by looking at chapters 26 and 27 in How to Write Anything. As you start writing your paper, you want to plan before you actually do any writing, and that's going to really help you with your organization. We can see in the How to Write Anything book as we get into chapter 28, they have some really good ideas on how to do this. First of all, you can visualize, and that's on page 407. I personally, when I've written before, I will actually sketch out on a piece of paper how I'm going to organize it, whether that's an actual outline, whether that's just a bunch of random ideas that I want to arrange into a way that makes sense to me. I can visualize it. That makes it easier to start writing it and then organize it later. I can make sure that I'm fitting that or adjusting as needed. Another good idea is to use the thesis statement, which we've learned about in another presentation. We can use that thesis statement as our center of support so that as we're organizing, we can remember, oh yeah, my thesis said I was going to be covering these 3 or 4 areas. I want to make sure that my organization reflects that. And if we need to change the thesis a little bit, we can. But it does offer a nice center of support. When planning our structure for our paper, then, we want to consider these 4 things: sequence, progression, importance, and relationships. Sequence has to do with the order in which things appear, and we want to ask ourselves, why did we put things in a certain sequence? Progression has to do with things building on top of each other. We also want to think about importance, considering which of your points might be most important, or as you get into argument papers, which is most persuasive. And sometimes you want to plan around the importance aspect because you want your readers to view things maybe from least important to most important or in some other order. You also want to consider relationships, and what that means is different points and different ideas are going to have stronger ties and relationships with each other than maybe with other points. And so you want to plan your paper so that the stronger relationships lead one to the next, and so your paper will hold together a little bit better that way. As you plan, you also want to remember your readers. Think about them and provide clear steps or signals for readers. As you want to help your readers see your structure. You're going to do that by providing transitions. We have a whole presentation on transitions. You also want to review. Sometimes, whether it's partway through your paper, whether it's toward the end of the conclusion, maybe in both places, depending on how long your paper is and how complicated your ideas are, you want to review and show readers, okay, remember we talked about this, remember that led to this, and these things build on each other to our last point. And that's where you also get into forecasting. Sometimes you want to tell readers, okay, here are the points we're going to cover next. Sometimes you would do that at the introduction to let everybody know what your organization is going to be. Sometimes you're going to do that even within a paragraph. So you might be writing about the war on terror, for example, and you're going to say, okay, in this next paragraph, we're going to cover this aspect, and this aspect of the war as it took place in Afghanistan. That way you're letting your readers know ahead of time what your structure is going to be, and they appreciate that. You don't always want to do that because sometimes you want your readers to follow you and trust you until you hit them with the point that you really want. But oftentimes focusing and organizing and forecasting ahead of time for your readers will really help. As you start planning and organizing your paper, then you're going to want to work on building an outline. This is going to be covered in chapter 27 of your How to Write Anything book. You'll want to pay attention to that because I'm going to be referencing that throughout this one specific presentation. Before we get into the actual content of this chapter, I want you to notice that they're working on one specific paper throughout this chapter. And I want to make sure we understand a couple of terms. First of all, MOOC. That means Massively Open Online Course. Now, if you are taking this as an online course at Ancilla College, this is not a MOOC. This is not massively open. This is a course where you have to be enrolled and admitted as a student at Ancilla College. You probably had to take some kind of a testing to make sure that you were able to enroll in this particular class, or maybe you took another class in order to be able to take this particular class. So there are some guidelines along with that. You pay tuition. A MOOC is usually free, or there is tuition along with it, but you don't receive credit for it at the end of the course. Whereas for this class, you do receive credit. So some of these things are fuzzy. This is a whole huge topic right now, and it's still very much emerging. Another thing that you'll notice is they're going to reference a correspondence course. That's something most students nowadays are not going to know what that is. That's sort of like an online course in that you may not ever see your professor face to face, but in the olden days, and even in a few places still, there's what's called a correspondence course, where you get the materials, you get your book, you get other things, you get some notes from the college, and you go through all those things, you take your tests, you write your papers, and they grade all those things, and then you get credit for the courses. Again, some of those were for credit, where you actually do get your credit in your transcript or graduation. Some of those were just things that people took because they thought they were interesting, wanted to learn more about them, wanted to get a different type of certification. Okay, enough of an introduction on that. Let's talk about these 3 items really quickly here. Ways to plan and build an organization. Looking in our chapter, one idea is to look for relationships. What this means is look for different points that relate to each other. Another way of explaining that is look for points that have something to do with each other. Either they're very similar, they're like each other, or maybe they're opposite. You want to move through your paper showing your reader things that are similar to each other before you get to things that are less similar, or you want to show a contrast, so you have one point that shows one side of something and then another point that shows a different side. You also want to look at subordination. What that means is that you're going to have topics and subtopics. So if you look at the example in the book where it says subordinate ideas, again, it shows topics and subtopics. You can see that they have a topic that's underlined there, and then they have points underneath that topic. If you're working on an outline for my class and you want to use this as basically your outline for me rather than having Roman numerals, then that is totally fine by me. This doesn't have to be all that formal. What I'm more concerned is to see that you're thinking and coming up with ideas and narrowing down your ideas. The other thing that we'll talk about here is sequence. That's just figuring out what order things go in. And sometimes with a sequence, you're going to have pieces that relate to each other, like we talked about before, that you want to keep together. Sometimes one point builds on another, though. You can see the example that they have here. It starts off just defining things. It starts off a MOOC, what MOOCs are, and then it moves to what MOOCs aim to do, so what they're trying to do. Then it moves to what MOOCs really do. So you're setting up your readers and telling them what something is defining itself as, or how you define something, and then 2 different points along with that. So there's a sequence and one idea builds along the next. And then when you're ready, you can do more of a formal outline if that's what you want to do.